My name is Joe Thomas. I am the founder and CEO of Loom, and this session is all about how to async like a pro. Before we dive into it, I just want to say how cool it is that Atlassian had Candace Parker come through today. Obviously, a lot of folks know Magic Johnson, but Candace Parker went to my high school. She was 7 years older than me, and she was an absolute legend during the entire time there. So I got to meet one of my life heroes today. So let's give it up for Candace Parker for a second. All right, so you've been to a few sessions at this point. You know what this slide is. It says, don't make a purchasing decision for Atlassian. If you do want to use it as a purchasing decision criteria for Loom, I'm all for that. So, don't hold back. All right, so I think at this point, really, we can all agree that remote and hybrid are here to stay. And the reason being is that this was a trend line that was already happening for 15 years in advance of the pandemic. A lot of us realized that we can actually do just as good of a job from home as we were in the office. And we also realized some of the deep benefits of remote and hybrid work because it ultimately enables flexibility. And flexibility to me is freedom. Freedom to set up your life in the way that you would like to, freedom to go into the office as you see fit. And to me, flexibility is the future. And I believe that deeply, and that's why we're building what we're building at Loom, which I'll get to in a little bit. But we also know that Atlassian really believes in this. I thought it was such a bold and brave move from Atlassian to say team anywhere, because it is a big bet, and there are very real challenges to accept when you say we want to hire the best people no matter where they are, and we want to enable them to engage as first-class citizens. And so ultimately, how do you do that? How do you enable freedom and flexibility by enabling people to work from wherever? Well, communication, I say this all the time at Loom, communication is the mother of all skills. You really can't get anything done without really great communication. And it is honestly deceptively, it seems simple on the surface, but it is deceptively hard when you start to peel back the layers of the onion. And there's a few stats here that most companies really do struggle with communication. We've run surveys with 3,000 workers. 72% come back with current frustration with communication tool. What I believe is that we're about 2 years into a decade-long change, and so the tooling needs to catch up with some of the modern problems that we're all experiencing in remote and hybrid. I know that everybody knows, and it's in the common lexicon at this point, about Zoom fatigue. I know that we certainly feel that at Loom. And then one of the other things around enabling freedom and flexibility for people in terms of enabling them to work from wherever or home primarily, there's been a spike in terms of this concept of workplace loneliness. Do you feel truly connected to the individuals that you work with? It's a hard balance between the two. And so most companies really struggle with communication in a real way, but it is also, as I said, the mother of all skills. So we got to go a little bit deeper into understanding how to do it better. So what you'll see on the left-hand side here, or sorry, yeah, your left hand, my left hand too, is that when we were working prior to the pandemic, really a vast majority of work happened in that bottom left quadrant. We were largely working synchronously, we were largely working together in an office, and then all of a sudden, overnight, we were all working apart. So what do? We rely on the existing behaviors that we already have, which is primarily working synchronously. That's why we were all of a sudden all on calls for 10 hours a day. But what we believe is that there's evolving needs for globally distributed teams. And so that's why we built Loom. And I'll get into a couple of the original thesis as to why we built against it, and then from there, how we understood the modern pain points that we were solving for. So the first point and the core thesis of why we started building Loom is that video is massive and important. If you think about video and how prolific it is in our day-to-day lives, not just at work, but also in the consumer landscape. How many videos are you consuming on your social platforms? And the fact that when we started building back in 2015, video recording and sharing wasn't really part of the day-to-day communication stack. So we felt like video was massive and important, and that it really does connect to the fact that consumer behavior leads enterprise behavior. When you go to set out to build a world-changing software, you want to find the biggest trend that you can possibly find. And for us, there is no bigger trend in the consumer landscape than video, and we wanted to bring some of that behavior to the workplace. So getting into a few of the stats that really captured our attention when we started building in 2015, Mary Meeker comes out with an internet trends report every single year. And what's fascinating about 2015 is that you'd see 57% of internet traffic, consumer internet traffic, in 2012 was video. And then you fast forward 3 years, 64% of all consumer internet traffic was video. So not only was it a majority of traffic, it was also the fastest growing segment of consumer internet traffic. If you fast forward 4 years, same exact report, Mary Meeker, 4 years later, the 2 fastest growing consumer platforms on the internet in 2019 were YouTube, which is a video distribution and viewing platform, and then Instagram. And it was in about 2017, early 2018, that Instagram came out with stories, and they started their evolution towards being a more video primary product than just their photos origin. And then truly, I mean, this is one of the most meteoric rises of all time, is that Google held the most trafficked website spot for 10 years. And now TikTok, at the end of 2021, is the #1 most trafficked site in the world. And video, they are the first consumer platform that is video only. So it just goes to show that there's this continuing trend about how important video is in the consumer landscape. And so when we think about how we end up identifying what the opportunity is in terms of translating this consumer behavior to enterprise behavior, we felt like the modern pain point was the fact that we needed to lean into the fact that folks are communicating on different timelines. And so that leans into asynchronous work. Asynchronous enables effective communication wherever, whenever. And just to give a little bit of a background and what progress that we've made since we started in 2015, we have a little over 17 million registered users. We have over 1 billion minutes recorded on our platform, and we have over 3.3 billion minutes watched. You can see that there is a very real inflection point. That was in March of 2020 when everybody started working from home, and we were building an asynchronous communication product. So Loom and asynchronous video is incredibly valuable when you're trying to enable great work from wherever, whenever. So now let's learn from some of the asynchronous experts. Of course, we'll go into a little bit of a story around Loom, but I really want to explain Automattic, and they are who we're all building on the shoulders of giants of for what remote work can look like. They were the ones who started the trend back in 2005, and then we've seen Figma's logo up on a bunch of these presentations. They are one of the most beloved products of the last 5 years. And we got a chance to do a little bit of research survey with them in terms of how do they use asynchronous work to build really great products. So Automattic, if you all aren't familiar with the name itself, they are the parent company for WordPress and all of the websites built on that. A fun fact about WordPress is they are 43% of the websites on the internet to this day, which is an unbelievable, mind-blowing stat. They started in 2005, they have about 2,000 employees, and all of them, they've been 100% remote from day one. So how did they end up doing this? How were they able to build a standout asynchronous employee experience? Well, they were the pioneers. They were the ones who started championing the fact that remote work can and will lead to better results as a business, because what does it force you to do? It forces you to lean into asynchronous work that helps build trust, that helps increase retention, and it really does foster inclusivity. If you allow somebody to document their thoughts in advance and you show up to a meeting with full context, does that allow you all to include the best brains and the best thoughts, not just the loudest voice in the room? So Matt Mullenweg is really the thought leader in remote work, at least from my opinion. And he has this blog post called Distributed Work's 5 Levels of Autonomy. So level 4 is when things go truly asynchronous, you evaluate people's work on what they produce, not on how they produce it. So this is where you can think about that more inclusive decision-making process. Maybe it's a little bit slower than if you were in a meeting together, but it's more deliberate. You can make sure to fully explore the thoughts. This was part of Mike's talk earlier, is that maybe you come to the right decision, even if it's not the fastest decision. And so I would tell you what level 5 is, but this talk is not about giving you all the answers. It's hopefully giving you threads to pull on. And so I would say that if you want to know what level 5 is, I highly encourage you to go to Matt Mullenweg's Distributed Work's 5 Levels of Autonomy. The thing that I'll leave you with is that he calls level 5 nirvana. So if that isn't compelling enough for you to go ahead and search for that, I don't know what would be. So they actually really leaned into, and I think that this is another great example of something like Atlassian deploying Atlas today. From what I understand, this has been a long time in the making for the Atlassian team, where they were building it and using it internally for a long time. Automattic has a tool called P2, and they built it off of their own blog-facing infrastructure, and so it allows for posting, and allows for comment threads, and it allows for more intentional collaboration and decision-making. And so I really encourage you all to go out and look at Matt Mullenweg's content. It really can give you a ton of frameworks to think about in terms of asyncing like a pro. All right, let's talk about Figma. Just unbelievable news that came out a few weeks ago. $20 billion acquisition by Adobe. It was the largest private transaction of all time. And that tells you something about how well that they executed across every facet of the business. But let's talk about specifically how they built what ended up being the main catalyst for this biggest acquisition of all time, which is how did they build world-class products asynchronous? So at the beginning of COVID, they really thought hard about how to build great products remotely, because they were actually a primarily in-office company culture, and then all of a sudden they were remote overnight. And so they actually wanted to push against the edges of what could they do in an asynchronous manner in working remote in order to build a new product. We're talking about FigJam, if you all are familiar with that, is that during the ideation phase, they also thought really hard about how to communicate and collaborate in a remote context. And so they said, let's see how far we can push the boundaries of asynchronous feedback and see how that can actually help us enable building a higher quality product faster. So the first part and the first phase of building out FigJam was, like all product building experiences, you end up building an alpha, and it's an internal release. And so they actually created a Slack channel called FigJam-feedback, and they required every single piece of feedback about FigJam to be intentionally documented and put in that channel. And from the Figmates who were part of the product team who were building this, they said that it made it easier to index the feedback that was coming in. It allowed feedback to come in at all hours of the day, and it allowed them to get to better decisions in a more accelerated fashion in order to iterate on the product better. And so they also really leaned into this concept of asynchronous feedback when it came to collecting feedback from their customers. So Netflix, Square, Stripe, they were all part of FigJam's beta process, and they actually didn't just use Slack, they also used a FigJam board where you could see not just your own team, like if you were on the Netflix team and you were giving feedback on FigJam, you could also see other teams' feedback from Stripe and Square. And they said it was really fascinating to see that they were able to collect higher volumes of feedback than they ever had been before through some of their more synchronous research processes, and that they were also able to get riffs, like as in this employee from Netflix left this feedback, and then a Square employee would leave feedback that is basically an iteration or a remix of the feedback. And so they were able to get higher quality feedback faster and build a better product. When they took 5 years to build Figma, the initial version of it, to come out of stealth, they actually ended up building and deploying FigJam in 9 months. So really, really impressive in terms of what asynchronous feedback was able to do for Figma in terms of building a better product faster. All right, so we're going to get into how Loom uses asynchronous video in order to build and connect teams a little bit better. And so when I think about the employee life cycle, when you think about building great teams and building great culture, it starts in the recruitment process, right? Can you attract the right people? How do you interview them? How do you assess their skill set? When you go to make an offer, offer acceptance rates are unbelievably important in terms of closing the candidate that you've decided that you want on the team. How do you welcome them? How do you onboard them? And then when they are at certain milestones in their employee experience, how do you acknowledge and celebrate those milestones with them? And so for us, when we think about this initial couple bullets that you see on here in terms of recruitment and interview, we actually use asynchronous video in a really what I consider to be compelling way. So when you reach out to candidates, we actually have a manager walk through the job description in a little bit more generic fashion. Immediately you go from a generic text-based job description to the manager who you'd be reporting into. You get to know that human a little bit better. How powerful is that? And then when it comes to actually interviewing the candidate as well, is that take-home projects. They are able to actually record a video, send it in advance, and that allows the team who is assessing that to watch the video, and it allows the candidate to maybe re-record. So that way you're not put on the spot for 30 or 45 minutes, and hopefully you stick that landing. Hopefully it's the best run-through that you've had of that take-home presentation. By pulling it into asynchronous, it allows for people to put their best foot forward at every stage of the interview process. And so we believe that asynchronous and making interview processes more and more from synchronous to asynchronous is going to be a great evolution in order to lean into this diversity of thought and letting people put their best foot forward. Also, we believe that asynchronous video is unbelievably powerful for onboarding. We've probably all been part of an onboarding process where it's the same person who's probably given a presentation maybe 15 or 20 times. The first couple times that they gave it when they're onboarding new employees, they're all excited about it, but by the 20th time, they're like, okay, let's get through this 45 or 60-minute session again. And so by recording it once, not only is it powerful because you get that first presentation energy, but it allows the employee to go back and revisit that content. And of course, a lot of onboarding content is written in text documents, but video is incredibly powerful, especially when you're a distributed team, because again, that human component. You get to see this person, you get to hear their voice intonation, you start to build some of these informal connections via video, with it being hyper efficient in nature because you don't need to do that same 45-minute presentation over and over and over again. So you get the information exchange and you get the human connection. And then lastly, I've heard about this all the time from employees when somebody gets to their Loom-iversary, which is like their 1-year or 2-year anniversary. We end up sending them a video from the manager. And if they're getting a promotion, usually it's 4 or 5 people who record a 30 or 45-second video about how proud they are of this individual. Here's the things that you've really influenced me and why I'm so excited about you getting this promotion. And then you stitch those together. And of course, that's a magical moment to watch it for the first time. But I've heard a dozen times that these employees who get these videos go back and revisit them 3 or 6 months later. Maybe they're having a tough day. Maybe they're questioning themselves about like, why did I get this promotion? I feel a little bit over my skis. And they go back and they watch this video and it's capturing a moment in time that is celebratory in nature that allows folks to revisit it. And so we believe that asynchronous not only allows for that human connection, but it also codifies it and allows those special moments to live on in the future. So kind of starting to bring it home a little bit is I love this quote from Mark Andreessen when towards the beginning of the pandemic, he was always a believer in remote work, but really with the acceleration of remote work, he said, "We may at long last shatter the geographic lottery, opening up opportunity to countless people who weren't lucky enough to be born in the right place." I think that this is an unbelievably powerful quote because I believe that asynchronous work, the more that we as collective teams and organizations and humanity can lean into high fidelity asynchronous work, it allows us to enable anybody, no matter where they live, to be able to engage as a first-class citizen. And when you do that and you normalize the opportunity curve, of course, we're all here in San Francisco, the Bay Area. I actually moved to Atlanta about a year ago without any sacrifice in terms of the productivity and effectiveness of the company overall. And I really do believe that this trend line is going to be better for humanity because the right people can be on the right teams at the right time, no matter where they live. And that'll accelerate innovation overall. And so the last thing that I'd say around this is that 64% of users say that they feel more connected to their teammates after using Loom and asynchronous video. So even if you're engaging from Sydney to San Francisco to London to India, being able to record video and send it to others without having to show up on a call at 1 a.m. or show up at 5 a.m., all of this enables you to build that human connection while enabling really great work to get done. So one last company that I wanted to go into in terms of unleashing the potential of all teams is Atlassian. And what's really cool has been seeing the way in which they have adopted Loom at this point. These charts maybe are a little bit hard to read the numbers themselves, but the orange one is the number of signups that they have on Loom. We are now at 100% of Atlassian employees have a Loom account. At the bottom in the purple chart, you see the number of minutes that are received and viewed on the Loom platform. And while that says 177,000 for Q2, I was just looking at the stats last night, and Atlassian will be at 350,000 minutes for Q3. So in terms of leveraging Loom and asynchronous video to enable their team to be anywhere and work as a first-class citizen, asynchronous videos is helping Atlassian along the way. So bringing it all together, my belief is that there's a better way to work, and that is asynchronous, really leaning into it. And so there's going to be 4 async tips that I have up here. The first one that I like to think about is this question, and I try and make it simple things that can be remembered, which is, how would I move this work forward if everyone on my team were asleep? So I think that this is a really powerful statement, because maybe you have 3, 4, 5 times throughout the day that you are moving work forward. And maybe sometimes your default behavior is to say, hey, do you just want to jump on a call really quickly? I have something to share with you as an update to the project. Not only should you lean into documenting and say that, what if everybody were asleep? But it's also imagine that you're asleep on the other side of it. So you can't actually jump in and add more context. So really do a great job of documenting where a project is at, and it will enable better decision making overall. But I think that this question I actually ask myself all the time, still to this day. I also encourage you not to just Google Matt Mullenweg and all of the great content that he has out there, but there's also this concept of bursty communication. So I think it's important when you think about developing a new skill set or going deeper into a skill set like async, you're like, well, what is the anti-behavior? And the anti-behavior is synchronous work or video calls. And so bursty communication was a study that was done by, I believe, an Oxford team that essentially studied remote teams and which were the ones that were highest performing in nature. And they were the ones that optimized as much of their percentage of the day for deep work. And then when they would come together, they would have this bursty communication moments, maybe for 1 hour or 90 minutes a day, and that they would really try and wrestle with the parts that they were stuck on the project on. But as much of your time that can be optimized for deep work, the better. And then also, again, going a little bit deeper into the anti-behavior of asynchronous is synchronous. I also think it's really important that synchronous meetings are not used for information dissemination. You shouldn't have somebody coming up and doing essentially what I'm doing right now, which is presenting a deck and talking to you all for 30 minutes straight. I would have way rather have sent you a Loom in advance and that everybody watched it, and then we could use our time together for Q&A or discussion around questions that you might have about the content. And so I think about this metaphor of passing the ball. You might remember when you were in kindergarten or maybe in first grade where you had to have the ball in order to speak. And so in a meeting, what you really should be optimizing for is the number of unique individuals that are holding the ball, essentially those that are sharing their ideas and concepts, and the number of times that the ball is passed. Because that means it's not information dissemination, it means it's collaboration, it means it's discussion, and that intertwines with that bursty communication that I was just talking about. And then the last thing that I think is critically important is to recognize no matter what stage you are at with asynchronous, know that it is a skill. It is something that takes persistence and experimentation. Not everything is going to work, but you need to give yourself and your team grace in terms of trying to figure it out because it is a new behavior. Human default behavior, thinking back to tribes, is that we all kind of gathered around a campfire and talked to one another. There was no concept of asynchronous work until we invented written language. So in terms of what our default human behavior is synchronous, and we need to lean into the fact that asynchronous is the future but it's also a skill, and it takes time, and be persistent with it, but also give yourself grace. And so the final slide I got here is that while asynchronous is hard, we've felt it at Loom. We've seen organizations like Atlassian experience the transformative power of asynchronous work, and I truly, deeply believe that asynchronous is the future because of that flexibility, because of that freedom that it enables, because it really does break down that geographic lottery that Mark Andreessen talked about. And so asynchronous is the future, and I hope that you got a few tips and things to follow up on out of this. So thank you all. And I think that and we're going to be doing a little bit of time for Q&A. So if you do have questions, the mic runners will be running around. And if you want to just stick your hand up, I should be able to hear you. Yep, we got one in the front right now. Oh, you'll go second.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. We see big companies like Meta going huge in metaverse and thinking like, virtual workspaces and metaverse may be the solution of the problems we are seeing in collaboration. So how do you see that?
Well, I think that everybody who generally gets asked the question about the metaverse, I think is like, there's so much left to be determined at this point. I think that the technology innovation cycle is really, really exciting. I think that the level of innovation that is coming out right now, I think is, it's truly hard to appreciate the pace at which the VR ecosystem is moving. But I still think that in terms of human behavior change is really, really hard. So my personal prediction is that even if the technology is there, I think it's going to be a while before you have enough the hardware fully immersed and enough people have it, and that there's enough of an app ecosystem that helps actually really solve for workplace problems, where Oculus has really started out as, and that's where Meta's kind of rooting is in consumer. And so there's a lot of gaming that's happened, and then Microsoft has HoloLens, and I think that that's really fascinating too. I think that there's a massive opportunity in the metaverse overall. I just don't know on what time horizon it will actually be adopted and utilized for work. And I think that to me, I guess this is documented, so you will quote me on it, but I think that we're still a decade away from VR being an actual day-to-day tool that we use at work.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for your trying to solve the problem of async collaboration. The one thing I'm curious about is, there's teams that do not have the technological infrastructure for that collaboration, like teams that have geographies that don't have high bandwidth
Yep.
of internet, places where there's no internet, no phones. How do you deal with that?
Well, I think that the one sub-bullet that you put in there around no internet, I think is unbelievably challenging in order to adopt any sort of software tooling, right? So that's the root of the issue, is if they don't have internet. And I think that things like Starlink are something that I'm really, really excited about, where it is trying to bring internet to the places that don't have it right now. I mean, their announcement with T-Mobile, where they're actually doing a partnership together for 5G, or not 5G, sorry, it's like a form of LTE bandwidth that will be beamed down, I think is a really great evolution for humanity, because it's still billions of people without access to the internet. Think about the amount of innovation that is lost, the access to information that is lost in order to improve life. And so from that perspective, I do think that there's, if we went back 5 years, I'd be like, I don't know what to do for the people with no internet. There's a bunch of experiments out there from Google X and Facebook that were launching hot air balloons into the sky. I do think that Starlink has some permanence to it. And I think that that can actually provide relatively low cost internet to places that don't have it. And then from there, I think that from a bandwidth perspective, we think about that with Loom all the time because video is computationally intense, right? When you think about video conferencing, Zoom has really won the market as a result of it being performant no matter what kind of bandwidth that you have. And so I think that that's part of the innovation curve, particularly around high fidelity, rich mediums that need to continue to innovate on over the course of time in order to make low bandwidth available for rich tools. But platforms like Atlassian or Trello, I think that while there's JavaScript and HTML, like there's rich components to it. There's stripped down versions that can actually work incredibly well on low bandwidth. So I think a lot of software is going to be ready to go out of the box from a low bandwidth perspective. Where we need to innovate is maybe on the metaverse or on video that can allow for low bandwidth to engage with best-in-class tools.
Hey Joe,
Hi.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
Definitely got introduced to a new concept of a new way of work, which is asynchronous, and I wasn't aware of that. So being a founder myself and leading a team and trying to see that this is more of like a way of work which might be personal to each individual in your team. How do you get the buy-ins from your team when you, as a team leader, want to follow this kind of a way of work with your projects and teams? So
it's a great question, and I think that the examples that Candice and Magic were sharing around leading through example, right? Are you pushing them as a boss? Are you pulling them and showing the behaviors that you want them to model? We think about that too. This isn't just repeating what they say. We talk about this concept of internal influencers in order to have a tool like Async Video and Loom be adopted at organizations. We really try and find those individuals that have social capital, and if they do, you actually, humans are largely mimicking creatures. Like we see other models of behavior and we want to do it ourselves, especially from people that we respect. And so I think that you are in a position of authority and power. And that comes with great responsibility. It's like you have to choose what behaviors, what tools, et cetera, that you want the rest of the organization to adopt. And so if you were in a different position, I'd be like, well, there's playbooks that we can share and here's like some handbooks that we can get you involved with. But I think that you as an individual, as a leader, as a person in a position of authority, you have that social capital to deploy and you just need to model the behavior. And I think folks will generally kind of follow your lead from that perspective.
Hey Joe, good job. Thanks for the presentation.
Thank you.
Love the product. Just had a question, where do you see the future for video, async conversations?
Mm-hmm.
I think your product does some of that, but I'm just wondering, where do you see that going? Do you see more recorded videos and that leading to a full conversation happening, or just curious your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that it's a great question and one that we've thought about a lot over the last 6 years is how much do we want to own the end-to-end conversation, and do we believe that people will go back and forth in asynchronous video, like recording and sharing? And we've ultimately first look at consumer landscape. Is there an async video platform where people share videos back and forth? There is one. It's called Marco Polo, but I don't think it's as prolific as some of the other platforms that I referenced earlier. And then from there, it's also what is the best thing to do as a high fidelity async form of communication like Loom. We've actually wanted to embed deeply across the ecosystem. So we have great partnerships with Atlassian across the board, but we also have thousands of other platforms that when you share a Loom link, it automatically expands into the video player. You click play, and then all of the comments and the conversation can happen in those other platforms. And so until we actually, I think, invest deeply in this async video communication loop, we're really going to focus on going deeper across other platforms that are experts in how to facilitate a conversation end-to-end versus Loom and async video is really when you need the ability to storytell or to explain something, right? And I think a high fidelity asynchronous form of communication is best positioned for that. One more? We got to cut it? Okay, one more. Sorry, Eddie.
Thanks very much for the presentation. And one question I had is you touched on something that rang true for me is changing human behavior, and our natural behavior is a hard thing to do. In your experience in organizations, is there like a common trend that you see when you talk about maybe common blockers to going async, and or do you see any common mistakes when people start that journey that where they kind of get off? Is there like a trend that you see in these things that we could maybe learn from?
It's honestly a great question. I think that when it comes to behavior change, it's really hard because ultimately we have neural pathways that like keep us in certain behavior patterns, right? So that's why some of the reference points that I had around the quote of like, if everybody was offline, right? If everybody was asleep, how would I document it? And really trying to break down some of those neural pathways. I think that to me, the most interesting thing when it comes to like behavior change, I think is like peer accountability. So when we were talking about being in a position of authority and modeling a certain behavior, that's great. But if you get a collective group of individuals that say, hey, I want to do this together, I think going on a hard journey solo makes it harder, right? But if you go on a hard journey with a team, like whoever your peers are that you work with day to day, and can we get alignment on the fact that we actually want to try and experiment with asynchronous, right? Like, let's see what sorts of experimentation that we do want to run here. And that's why I use the word experiment purposefully, because I do think that you should take the experiment framework, which is like, write down all the things that you believe could lead us to better asynchronous behaviors, and then drag one over into like, hey, we're actually doing this one right now. And then say what worked, what didn't work, what's the retro, right? Like that's a common product building principle of like, what worked, what didn't work, what's one thing that we're going to change. And I think taking a more principled approach to it overall versus an ad hoc, and then doing it as a team versus an individual is ultimately going to set it up for success. All right, I think Eddie's kicking me off stage, so really appreciate y'all. Have a great rest of your day.